Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, highlights from the annual Defense News Conference. A full day of conversation with leading lights from the Pentagon and defense industry on a host of topics. On tap, we've got an interview with Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth. How is the service modernizing itself for future fights? She has the details. Plus, the commander of the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory stops by. Want to know what they're cooking up down there in the lab? Don't miss that back and forth. And dawn of the drone fleet. We look at the future of unmanned vehicles for the Navy. Finally, a talk with the Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Our Capitol Hill Bureau Chief came armed with questions on a range of topics. Hear what he has to say. It's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Diana Stancy. The annual Defense News Conference is a mecca for Pentagon and defense officials looking to the future and mapping out ways for the U.S. to maintain a strategic edge. This year, we had experts and officials from around the branches, plus top leaders from Capitol Hill and the defense industry, all on hand to talk about the latest in their fields. In this special episode, we'll bring you highlights from the 2024 event. Let's kick off with a headliner. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth joined Defense News at the event to talk about modernizing the Army and its battlefield tactics. Here she is with land warfare reporter Jen Judson, discussing the challenges and opportunities the Army faces as it evolves to meet future threats.
You recently traveled to the Indo-Pacific. You were stopping in countries like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines. How has the Army's relationship with these countries evolved in recent years, and what are some of the ways you see the Army expanding its presence and capability to deter an increasingly aggressive China in the region?
I would say, Jen, it's really remarkable how much our relationships with armies in the region have deepened. And for me, my reference point is really from when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, and just seeing how much closer and how much deeper the partnership is now with the Japanese self-defense forces, the ROCs. We've obviously had an incredible alliance with the ROCs for many, many years, but particularly seeing how much closer we are with the Philippines is really remarkable. And I think you can see that in a number of different ways. For example, in the Philippines, we had, we've been doing a number of fairly complex exercises there. We had our mid-range capability deployed in the Philippines, I think to considerable effect. I always think that demonstrating those kinds of combat capabilities strengthens deterrence in the region. I think a marker of kind of the deepening partnership with the Japanese is their decision to agree to host our new composite watercraft company at Yokohama. I was able to see that myself. And I just continue to see, there's more trilateral cooperation. And again, there's just, more multinational participation in exercises like Talisman Sabre. And the complexity of those kinds of exercises is increasing every year.
Okay. You talked a little bit about making sure that you had capability forward. Can you speak in more specifics on what that is starting to look like, with the Philippines, with Japan, with Korea, and potentially some of these other smaller islands? You've done a lot of exercising in Palau, for instance. What are some of the things that you've been seeing that present opportunity for being able to, keep things more forward in theater?
I think, first of all, we have to always remember that when it comes to being forward in Indo-PACOM or anywhere, we have to go at the pace of the nations themselves. Individual countries are going to decide what is in their national interests, and we have to be respectful, I think, of their sovereignty and their assessment of what makes sense for them. So our goal, I think, in the Army has been to really try to have as much combat credible capability forward in the Indo-PACOM theater as we can through exercises, to really try to have as much as we can forward west of the international date line, 6 months a year or more. And we've been doing that, I think, through exercises and through having rotating capabilities like MRC, like the MDTF. We have been seeing Australia, for example, let us leave some equipment behind in Bandiana after Talisman Sabre, and I think they're supportive of seeing us build that out. We, have some non-lethal equipment sort of oriented towards humanitarian relief and disaster relief in the Philippines. And, the Philippines have let the MRC be operating there through exercises for quite a while. And so I think those are some examples of how we're making progress. I was in Germany in February and had the opportunity to see some of the training we were doing of the Ukrainians, and I spoke to a Ukrainian battalion commander, and he talked about how, the Russians were really increasing their EW capabilities in ways that were concerning. So those three categories are places where I think the Army needs to invest more. I think you'll see that in the budget that goes up to Congress next spring. That's an area where I think we also need to have more agility in our funding mechanisms, because the technology in those capability areas is changing so rapidly that we can't afford to get locked into something and then be only allowed to use that something for the next 10 years. We need to be able to move money around to purchase what is kind of the best coming out of industry. So that's something we've been talking a lot about with Congress is, is there a willingness to give us more agility in terms of moving money, perhaps in those three specific areas?
All right, well, that answer is a perfect segue to the next question that I had, which is, shifting over to Ukraine. You did get the opportunity to see how you were training Ukrainian soldiers. So aside from Unmanned, can you provide some more examples or information on what Ukrainian soldiers have been able to teach the Army about its own formation and strategy?
Yeah, it was fascinating actually when I was over there in Grafenwehr. I came away with the strong sense that our soldiers were learning as much from the Ukrainians as we were teaching to the Ukrainians. A lot of what we were learning, again, was just the density of drones and all of the different ways that drones are being used. And I think, we are incorporating those lessons into how we are training. Some of you, may have seen some articles. General George took a number of members of the media down to Fort Johnson in Louisiana to see some of what we're doing in terms of transforming in contact. And we now have our OPFOR sending drone swarms, to test our ability, our brigade's ability to sort of deal with that. Something else we've really, learned from the Ukrainians in a very real way is it is incredibly important to minimize signature. The battlefield is increasingly transparent, and your Fitbit, I don't wear one of those rings that tells you how poorly you're sleeping, but a lot of our soldiers do. And, even little things like that can generate a signature. And so we've really been working on how do we minimize our signature? How do we make our command posts much smaller and more mobile? We've gone from having command posts that take hours to set up to being able to set up small command posts in a couple of Humvees in just 15 minutes. And so those are some of the things I think that we've been, really taking away from the experience of working with the Ukrainians.
When we return, do we even need sailors anymore? The Navy's drone fleet is a big priority. We get an update on how the Sea Service is expanding unmanned capabilities for future conflict. Welcome back. Scaling up the use of unmanned vehicles is a top priority for the Navy, with extensive testing of prototypes and experimentation in multiple fleets. But when and how should the Navy start buying UAVs at the scale needed to effectively use them? How and where should they be deployed? An official spearheading the Navy's UAV development was on hand to talk about what's coming. Have a look.
This is a question I'd like to pose to all three of you. We'll start with you, Ms. Engelhardt. What do you see as the main obstacles for the Navy when it comes to innovating in the unmanned space? I don't need to tell you or anybody else in this room that, you know, the DoD and the services have a long list of priorities, but finite dollars and resources. So from your vantage point, what are kind of the main obstacles to, you know, advancing the Navy's unmanned capabilities?
Yeah, so I would like to say that it's predominantly culture, right? We have been, for the longest time, building very exquisite capabilities that are around for 30 years, right? So that's kind of the going in position. So changing that mindset of how do I do something fast at scale that is fieldable, and understanding that building the doctrine, right, at almost simultaneously with innovative tech is a little bit unusual, and we haven't had to do that in decades. So I think the biggest thing that we see in our challenge is, how do I move money? How do I get contracts in place? And then how do I build an industrial base to support that?
As we watch the unmanned ecosystem move so rapidly, how do we ensure that our organization can keep up with it? And how do we ensure that our manning and training and equipping of our ships can keep up with the pace at which this new innovation is moving? So that's one of the challenges. And then the other thing you mentioned, Dorothy, that I watched firsthand was, you know, how do you fund things that are moving so rapidly and get them out at pace? And so those were some of the challenges that we worked through at Task Force 59.
When you talk about unmanned and AI, those are big words. Like, what does that really mean? And what Task Force 59 to us was really being able to do is to show what's the reality. What is the limit of unmanned? How do you employ AI? I'd like to tell a vignette with Admiral Cooper. So Admiral Cooper is the old 5th Fleet commander. He's now the Deputy CENTCOM commander. So he and I are in a operations center, and there's 2 screens. There's one over here that's got 100 contacts, and we're in Jordan and trying to make sense of these contacts in a traditional way. And you can imagine, if you've been in that, you know, there's a lot of phone calls, there's radar going on, and people are trying to make sense of what the contacts are. On this side, you've got 7 sensors integrated, porting data into a data repository, running algorithms on it. And the AI is quickly saying, of those 100 contacts, these are the 15 you care about for a bunch of different reasons. And oh, by the way, you missed these other 10. So as an operational commander, he turned to me and it's like, wow, that's what AI does. Yeah. You know, and so the point is, you know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if you had asked me, is AI important? I would have said, oh, absolutely. And if you'd asked me why, I would have said, I have no idea, but I know I'm supposed to say that, right? But now, I think now I understand, okay, that's really what it does. And so to answer your question, so you have a guy who just came back from the front lines, as it were. He is experimenting on a day-to-day basis with a systems of systems. So he's got unmanned assets in all 3 domains. He's got mesh networks, he's got Starlink, he's got AI. And so you are now seeing actually what all this can do.
Most people know that one of the deadliest weapons in the military is money. A big budget is the backbone of a large and complex defense network, and so it pays to know what the people who pull the purse strings are thinking. For a talk about the issues and questions facing members of Congress regarding military and defense topics, from funding to global conflicts to the potential next commander-in-chief, we invited the Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee. Here he is with Military Times Congressional Bureau Chief Leo Shane. Check it out.
Well, thank you all for being here. Congressman, thank you for coming to give us a perspective on how everything's going to get fixed on Capitol Hill in the next few weeks. So, we're 26 days out from a partial government shutdown. We don't have a defense budget. We don't have lots of the budget stuff done. Can you tell us what the state of play is right now and how much all of us should panic about what's coming next?
Well, I think we know we're not going to get 7 appropriations bills, the remaining ones done between now and the end of the fiscal year. So in light of that, looks like there's going to be another continuing resolution that'll come up next week, probably the middle of next week. The debate has been, how long should that CR go? Listen, I personally believe that it should just go into the remaining portion of the 118th Congress, wherever that may be, since these bills have passed out of committee. At least some of them have passed the floor. It's a little bit easier to navigate that than it is waiting until the 119th Congress and everything has to get spun back up. And then the challenge is not only of that, but of a debt ceiling and the other aspects that'll be there. New administration, you put all those things together, and it's much more complicated process, I think, if you push it to the 119th versus the 118th. So I think the only thing left for the discussion back and forth is when will this current CR expire? But I don't think there's any question about what we will be facing, and that is, unfortunately, another CR. And of course, obviously from the military side, CRs are the worst way for us to be able to manage the defense enterprise.
Well, and I wanted to ask you about that because, it is an election year. I think we all saw this coming. We thought there would be a CR, but you've heard from Pentagon officials, you've heard from everyone that this is not the way to run the budget. This is not the way to run the government here. So how does Congress get back on track? How do we get back to a place where maybe not all 7, but maybe something passes before the end of the fiscal year, or are we just destined to have January 1st be the new start of when the budget gets passed?
Listen, a couple things need to happen. First of all is I think that members of Congress need to be held accountable for getting the job done. Get a budget done on time. I got a bill called No Budget, No Pay. You don't get a budget done by April 15th, which is what the Constitution says, you don't get a paycheck. Now, the Constitution says you can't take away pay, but you can certainly hold it in abeyance until the job's done. The same way with August recess, I beg the Speaker, and I do it each year, whoever the Speaker is, to say, keep us in town until all 12 appropriations bills are done. What a great motivating factor. Listen, Mitch McConnell did it. It's been almost 9 years ago now, kept the Senate in town. Guess what happened? All 12 appropriations bills got passed. So until you create a connection with the individuals, I think we're going to continue to be mired in this.
When we return, with all this talk about planning for the future, don't forget to apply that to your own situation. Do you have a good strategy for preparing for a financial emergency? Our financial expert has tips on how to get it done after the break. Welcome back. On this edition of Money Minute, Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union brings you tips on what qualifies as a financial emergency and how you can prepare for one.
Do you have a rainy day fund? If you said yes, that means you're ready for unexpected car trouble or big-time roof repairs. The truth is, only about 44% of Americans are prepared for an expense over $1,000. And the other truth is, life happens and it's unpredictable. The importance of stockpiling cash for emergencies can't be overstated. You should always have at least 3 months of living expenses saved. The way to get there, especially if you don't have a lot of income, is to find the areas in your budget that you're overpaying for things or are overpaying for unnecessary things. You know the drill. Cut out expensive coffee runs and subscriptions and memberships you don't use. Once you start building your savings, put it into an account that earns higher interest rates so you can reach your goals faster and maximize your dollars. Think money market savings accounts or CDs. Once you've established your emergency funds, you've already started the savings habit, so keep it going. Save for continued education, a mortgage, or even retirement. We don't always know what life has in store for us, but we can prepare, be confident, and be ready for whatever the future brings.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, step out of that skiff and search your unsecured device for militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to show off your brainpower down in the dining facility, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most recent headlines. Lastly, if social media is where you collect open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. And just like most junior service members, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, the head of the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory brings a deadly robot into the conference and turns it on. Just kidding. But he did talk about some interesting stuff. Don't go away. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Diana Stancy. It's a time of change for the Marine Corps. A force redesign, expansion, and alteration of capabilities in the Pacific, and other evolutions are underway for the service. So what technology is the Corps exploring to adapt to the changing conditions and new ways of fighting? Who better to ask than the commander of one of the coolest sounding offices in the military, the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory. Here's what he had to say about the tech his force is developing.
Would you say that most of the kind of future technology efforts that you're overseeing are within the drone or counter-drone space? And if they're not, are there any other examples you can kind of showcase for us?
Yeah,
within an unclassified setting,
absolutely.
of course.
Yeah, please keep me from getting fired. That would be great. I think we are doing a lot with drones. Robotics, AI, all of that is now coming together for us. We're doing it on the land, in the air, on the sea, and subsurface, all simultaneously. In addition to that, I think we're experimenting with a lot of tactics, techniques, and procedures on how we would actually integrate these. And so what we call organic precision fires, or what many refer to as loitering munitions, how do we get that into the hands of the Marines and get them the reps and sets on that particular piece of equipment, so that we can employ those in ethical ways that enable us to be more efficiently lethal on the battlefield.
You mentioned earlier kind of how the technology is developing so fast these days. Do you see it kind of reaching a point where the technology will get to a certain kind of baseline level and you can build off that? Or is it always going to be a race in this day and age going forward to keep up with those technological advancements?
Well, I think it's always going to be something that's going to continue to evolve. I think it's just the pace of that evolution is so rapid now that we aren't necessarily used to that. Starting flying F-18s back in the 90s, you would have IR countermeasures, and then there'd be a countermeasure, and then you'd come out with something to combat that as well. It's a similar thing now, only back then we were dealing in, generally years as those systems would continue to evolve. Now we're talking about months, if not weeks. And so the speed and pace at which that's changing now just complicates how we get new kit to the Marines, how we get that forward, how we train them on that, and then continue that evolution. I think many of you will see in open source that, currently in Ukraine, some of those munitions and some of those unmanned aerial systems, they're changing rapidly in weeks and months. And so how do you then try to procure something that's always going to continue to evolve? Contested logistics and the ability to maneuver in the littorals becomes key. And for that, what we're looking at is trying to acquire systems that we deem risk-worthy, meaning that we don't necessarily want to just waste them, but we'd rather put something in there that's autonomous, that doesn't have humans on it, that can do some of these higher risk missions without having personnel put in that riskier situation. I think a great example we have that we're working with right now, we got from the OSD's Raider program. We were able to accelerate what we call the autonomous low profile vessel. Truth be told, this is just a narco boat. We stole the idea from friends down south. And so this is 55 feet long, completely autonomous. It's able to go hundreds or thousands of miles. It's able to carry weapon systems that we have that are new. It can carry fuel, it can carry food, it can carry pretty much anything you want to put in it. And we've had the ability, what's really interesting from my perspective, is we actually took a Marine cook, and in 21 days, we trained him to operate this system using PLEO, and we were able to drive it from islands in Japan while it's operating off the west coast of the United States. And that's an example there of a capability that then can enable us to have resupply with a risk-worthy vessel in contested environments, and then help resupply the force.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.